At this time of year, you have to be ready for anything when it comes to the weather. From rain, snow, or my least favorite, the dreaded wintry mix. But one thing I love about my Rover rain cape is that it fits over whatever I'm wearing. If it's cold and rainy outside and I have a big winter coat on, I just put the Rover on and stay dry, without the need for another bulky layer. So no matter what Mother Nature throws my way, I'm ready. Honestly, if there is one essential piece of gear I like to have with me when I'm out and about, it's my Rover. And because it comes in an array of bright colors, it stands out on those cold, gray winter days. Listeners of the War on Cars can save 15% on everything in the Cleverhood store. So get the best rain gear for cycling and walking at cleverhood.com/waroncars with code Happy New Year. That's cleverhood.com/waroncars, discount code Happy New Year.
The street can either bring us together and knit us together, or it could rip us apart. And I think that his research really helped open our eyes to what I also call not just the conflict and the power dynamic of the streets, but also the promise. Like, what is the promise of our streets?
This is The War on Cars. I'm Sarah Goodyear. I'm recording this in Brooklyn shortly after returning from the second leg of our book tour. It is really good to be home and relaxing for a second. I'm going to just get a little business out of the way really quickly before we get to today's guest. First of all, you can find us on Patreon at patreon.com/thewaroncarspod if you want to support us. We really do depend on our Patreon supporters, so thank you so much to all of you. And if you're interested in getting our book, Life After Cars, Freeing Ourselves from the Tyranny of the Automobile, you can do that by going to lifeaftercars.com, and there you will find links to many booksellers, including bookshop.com. And you will also find our upcoming tour dates. We do have more dates booked in 2026 already. I think the first one is in Miami in mid-January. So go check it out, lifeaftercars.com. All right, let's get right to our guest, because we have a really special one with us here today. This is somebody who has spent a lifetime thinking about what we mean when we talk about livable streets, and why it is so important that we build our cities with human beings in mind, first and foremost. Dr. Bruce Appleyard is a professor of urban design and city planning at San Diego State University. Bruce's research makes an appearance in Life After Cars, which we'll talk about in a moment, and his father, Donald Appleyard, was a legend in this field for his work that led to the indispensable book Livable Streets, published in 1981. And we talk about him in the book, too. In 2020, Bruce published Livable Streets 2.0, which brings his father's book up to date while preserving its core principles and teachings. Bruce Appleyard, welcome to The War on Cars.
Thank you so much. It's a great honor to be here with you and to talk about this important topic for our entire world.
So, looking at Livable Streets 2.0, you include the original dedication that your father put in the book to children whose lives are threatened by traffic, and to all those who suffer noise, vibration, fumes, dirt, ugliness, loneliness, alienation, or other impoverishments due to its presence. I just think that that is so beautiful, and in such a short little space, it sums up so many of the things that automobile traffic does to us and takes from us, and it just sums it up so perfectly.
Yeah, my father was a very poetic writer, and I think he was able to capture things very well. And it sort of touches on a bigger background story of the book, which is when I was 4 years old, I was hit and nearly killed by a driver. And my father at that time started the research that became seminal to Livable Streets And the sad part about Livable Streets was that a year after Livable Streets was published, my father was killed by a speeding drunk driver when I was 17. The book was never reprinted, but it captures both how the book itself is bookended by these two horrific events of traffic violence, and yet my father, throughout the book, and what I try to do with the update to the book as well, is to capture what cars really mean to our community, how they harm us, their invisible harms, how they affect us, our social connections, our sense of community, our sense of place, as well as the issues associated with collisions and casualties.
So it's my understanding from reading the book that you didn't really have a memory of being hit by this driver. Can you talk a little bit about what your awareness was as you were growing up of that incident and how it had affected your family?
Sure. So I was hit by a car and a driver and thrown about 30 feet and went into the hospital and went into a coma for about a day. As I understand it, trauma will erase your memory of the actual collision. And I have faint memories of the ambulance showing up and things like that. But the memory of the accident was erased from my conscious understanding of things. But every so often, as I was growing up, I was visited by the most horrific nightmare of a wall of metal and glass rolling over my right shoulder and tossing me with indifference. And I understood that later in life when I started taking psych classes at UC Berkeley, that was the traumatic memory of the collision that occurred. And that affected me quite a bit growing up, to remember what it was like to actually be hit by a car.
So that must have been so terrifying for your parents. Did your parents talk to you about that experience much as you were growing up?
Oh, absolutely. And as I started to work on Livable Streets 2.0, I started interviewing people that worked with my father, and they kept saying, were you the son that was hit by a car and nearly killed? Because your father couldn't stop talking about you. Mm. So my father's concern and care for children came out of his concern and care for his own child. And it wasn't a rhetorical exercise for him. He actually felt the visceral concern that a parent would have for a child's safety. And so that was a major part of Livable Streets.
Yeah. And, we talk on the show a lot about how sometimes people can see harms that are being caused, environmental harms. They can only see them clearly when their children are affected. Like, we can see, it's not okay for a child to be in this situation, when we might just say for ourselves as adults, like, okay, well, that's just the way it is. But a lot of people do get kind of radicalized into this movement when they have kids and they see them on the street and they're say, wait a second, this is not okay.
Right. No, it's an important barometer to us as to how we view children in and around our streets and their safety. And it's an important research that I've done with asking parents questions about how they feel about their children's safety, that yields quite interesting results. And it's important for us to understand how streets work for children, as they are important aspects of our communities, are both our children and our streets, and how we actually try to get them to work together.
Your father became passionate about these issues and did this amazing work for the city of San Francisco, surveying different neighborhoods and the people in those neighborhoods about what their social lives were like, what their experience of streets were like. And we can get into that in more detail, we will. But right after, as you say, the book that was based on his research, Livable Streets, was published, he was tragically killed by a drunk driver. And maybe you could tell us about what that was like for you as a 17-year-old and how that has reverberated through your life.
Absolutely. So essentially, the day before he was killed, I drove him to the San Francisco airport, and in those days you could walk to the gate, and I hugged him goodbye, and we talked about when we'd see each other again. And then 2 days later, I was sitting down for homework at my home in Berkeley, and the call came in, and next thing I know, there's my mother's screaming bloody murder because they've just told her that my father was killed by a speeding drunk driver. And as happens with traffic deaths, and it's incredibly sudden. It's absolutely sudden. And there's so many balls up in the air that to this day, I'm still working to kind of help bring some of those down for my father's professional life. But even for my family, it left an incredible crater in our family. As the main breadwinner and the mainstay of the family, it was hard to miss him like that. So it's incredibly painful. And to this day, even sitting here today, it's a little bittersweet because there's both a celebration of my father's work and my life, but yet we also have to talk about the reality of how tragic this was and what cars have done to our communities and to our families and to our people. All those things really come together. And working on Livable Streets 2.0, it was both cathartic, but it was also heartbreaking a lot along the way as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. I just lost my own father just 3 years ago, and he didn't get to see my book come out. And I know that how I feel about that, and how to have your whole adult life and all of your accomplishments be something that that your father would have been so proud of you, and to not be able to share that with him must be incredibly painful.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear about your loss.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It was much more time appropriate. But yeah, these are the things. And then you do start thinking about what values have you been passed on by your parents, and how can you exemplify those, the good things that they've given you, and how can you bring those forward in the world? And that's really what you've done with this edition of this book, because, I think people inside this movement, the Livable Streets movement, as it is often called, many of them know your father's work and have seen it summarized. But yeah, just finding a copy of the book, it's not easy. It's something that is not readily in circulation. And so I think it's so important to reiterate these ideas. And let's get into that right now. You start the book by defining the idea of a livable street. So maybe you could talk about what a livable street is and why that idea is so important as we think about how we build our cities.
Well, a livable street is like a good friend. It's one that gives you energy. It helps bring you together. It helps connect you with members of the community, of who you are. It helps you take care of business as you need to, access different things to buy and food to get, and to replenish yourself, to nourish yourself. Whereas a unlivable street is a street you want to avoid. It takes energy out of you, and it doesn't give you a chance to really recuperate. It just is an impersonal, socially isolating place. And so those are some of the things I think about when we think about a livable street and an unlivable street. And these are the things my father showed in his research, in his seminal graphics of the research as well, that I think are worth talking about.
Yeah, that's what I was going to go to next. So let's talk about what he discovered. And specifically, I think one of the things that is just so remarkable, and that we wrote about in the book, and that many people have pulled out, and it's really startling research that's been replicated since. And it talks about the effect on social ties on streets with light, medium, and heavy traffic. Could you summarize that and sort of explain what the graphics show?
Sure. I believe we'll make these available up online with the podcast.
We'll put this on our show page at thewaroncars.org. and you'll be able to, if you want to just pull them up while you're listening or after you've listened, we'll put up these graphics so you can see exactly what you're talking about. But why don't you describe them to us, Bruce?
I will. And I just want to say that I think these graphics are some of the most iconic graphics of research in city planning and urban design. Mm-hmm. They really have just withstood the test of time and really have enduring legs to talk about the research. And effectively what my father did was he found 3 streets in San Francisco that were similar in all respects, except for their levels of traffic. And then he asked a series of questions. He had the graphics organized where you have light on top, which makes sense, moderate, and then heavy at the bottom. And he asked a series of questions. And one question he asked was, what is the location of your friends and acquaintances? And what the graphic shows is that on a light traffic street, if you don't have very much traffic, a livable street is one that knits the community together. You have people who are showing their social ties across the street in all forms and fashion, all the way across the street, multiple times, and creating a really strong web of connection between the community. So a light traffic street knits a community together, whereas a heavily trafficked street rips your community apart. And you have 3 times as many friends and twice as many acquaintances on a light traffic street versus a heavily trafficked street. And this became a seminal research to show the invisible harms that traffic has on our social ties and our ability to build community, much more so than collisions and casualty rates. And it shows that there's so much more of an impact that cars have on people and communities.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things that there's been a lot of emphasis over the last 10 to 15 years on the Vision Zero model, which there's a number of things to say about that, and we won't get into all of it. But, the idea that we're aiming for 0 fatalities and serious injuries, and that's a worthy goal, right? Mm-hmm. But as you say, it doesn't address the multiple harms that traffic does to us, even when it's not directly killing us. And, those include these social effects that your father so deftly teased out with his research. And, and I think that it's something we all understand intuitively, but to actually have the data to back it up is really profound and I think really important. And I talk about his research and this aspect of it all the time because I think everybody should know this.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it just shows you the multiple harms that cars have on our communities, much more so than just the casualty rates. Up until this point, it was hard for anyone to imagine or really put their finger on it. But everyone probably had a sense that cars were having this effect. But it wasn't until this research and the graphics that were created by Betty Drake, by the way, a great illustrator that worked for my father. It wasn't until these graphics were created that people really saw these harms that were invisible up until that point.
And in his book, he also talks about the way that different demographic groups are affected by this, that a lot of families would be moving away from heavy traffic street or even the moderate traffic street as the traffic was increasing, that was, sort of forcing people out of their historic neighborhoods. And then what really struck me was that many people who were left on the high traffic streets were, I think that he said that many of them were older people, women, especially widows perhaps, who didn't have anyone that they were living with, that they were completely isolated and increasingly isolated as the traffic, sort of kept them inside, and the fear and the noise just contributed to their isolation, and then younger people were moving away because it just wasn't a desirable place to raise children.
That's right. I mean, people who could move away would move away, and people who were there were then more isolated. So they became socially desolate, isolated places. And yes, he found that that there were older individuals who were basically stuck in these apartments and without really any means to connect with those outside or along the street or across the street.
Right. And we're talking here about people who are living in San Francisco, which was and remains one of the most dynamic, walkable cities in the United States of America, and considered to be, I think when people think of San Francisco, they don't think of it the same way they might think of, say, Houston or Los Angeles as being a place where cars completely dominate everything. But even so, cars were deforming really social relations. And this was in the late 60s when he began his research. So, I think that generationally we've lost track of how much we've lost, that our awareness of what sort of a baseline normal life might be like in a human settlement has been so radically altered over the past 5 or 6 generations that we don't even really know what we're missing in a way.
Right, exactly. And when you start moving to the suburbs and people are just really totally socially isolated, the way the suburbs are designed, at least folks here were experiencing traffic and had sort of a sense of an urban life. But we've seen people, leaving these streets, going to the suburbs and escaping, if you will. And it's created another sort of social isolation in our culture when we have people that are so then in such auto dependency.
Yes, and that actually makes a great transition to some of your own research that has also just really caught the imagination and the interest of so many people, myself included. And that is the work that you've done with cognitive mapping and children and kids who live in neighborhoods like what you're talking about, where they're not hanging out on the street and playing on the street, or where that's not sort of something that's been historically done. And so why don't you talk about your research about kids and their cognitive maps and how you've explored that reality?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Inspired by my father's work in Livable Streets and also his mentor's work, Kevin Lynch, in The Image of the City, I created a research approach that merged the two methods and asked questions about the effects of traffic and inadequate pedestrian facilities on school children who are 9 and 10 years old in the suburban San Francisco Bay Area, in Contra Costa County to be exact. And I had children draw maps to help explain their journey from home to school. In one of the communities I looked at a heavily trafficked community and a lightly trafficked community. And in the heavily trafficked community, there were no sidewalks leading to school, even though it was built in the model of the neighborhood unit principles, where you build your neighborhood around a school in a way that kids can walk to it, so they don't have to cross any busy streets. So there was no sidewalk in this heavily trafficked street, and we compared the light traffic street with the heavily trafficked neighborhood, and then I helped the community get a grant to build a pathway along its busiest street. So I did a study before the pathway was built and after the pathway was built, and found some really interesting results. I found that there's a major effect of building the pathway along the heavily trafficked street. Before the pathway was built, there were enormous notations of danger and dislike, and a very limited sense of place and community that the children felt. They also had fewer places that they liked to play and enjoy, and fewer locations for their friends and acquaintances. After the pathway was built, there was a much richer sense of place. There was many fewer indications of danger and dislike, many more places where children like to play. For example, the before group indicated danger twice the rate of the after group. They represented dislike 5 times more than the after group. And the sense of place improved by 3 times between the before and after group. So there was all these really great things that came from just building a sidewalk where you should have built it in the first place. So I was just up in University Place up in near Seattle, Tacoma, with Dan Burden in the past few days, and we were looking at a whole community that used to have no sidewalks whatsoever. And they've done a tremendous job in building projects that have sidewalks. And this is the same kind of condition where we're trying to actually just build sidewalks so children can have a really wonderful experience. Just a couple other maps that were interesting. One was from a child who was driven everywhere. And to be asked how to get from home to school, they saw their world as a series of unlinked paths between home and other locations, but nothing was really connected, and it's a very sterile sense of their world with no sense of context or place. And they would, for example, go on the road to their friend's house, then to the mall, then Petco, then back, and then one path takes them to the school in their church, and another path will take them to the other climbing tree. So basically, when driven everywhere, children became cognitively disconnected from their environment. And this was an important thing to find out about how children who are driven everywhere really have a limited sense of their home community. Another student was able to walk and bicycle everywhere and had a much stronger, and these students both were given the same amount of, same instructions, the same amount of time to draw their maps, and they drew dramatically different maps. And this other child who's able to walk and bicycle everywhere had a much richer sense of place, of the trees, of the creek in their school, and a great understanding of the street patterns of their street. And they offered a testimony, which I'll read to you now, which is, I like my neighborhood because I have lots of friends, because I can play there whenever I want. I like everything in my neighborhood, and I also dislike nothing in my neighborhood. And I also ride my bike everywhere or I walk. And again, sort of a strong, powerful testimony about what it means to be able to walk and bike in your neighborhood.
Yeah, I love the combination of, the hard data and then the testimony, and that's something your father did as well. And I think it's a really powerful combination. I always think about this work that you did, and I think about parents and how much time these days parents spend, especially affluent, educated parents, how much time and money they spend getting their kids every single class and tutor and advantage that they can possibly find to pay money for. And yet they often are containing their children in an environment that radically limits their children's ability to use their natural aptitude for navigating, for exploring, for understanding environment. And if you care about your child's development, wouldn't you want them to be able to explore the world in the way that children of human beings and hominins have done for millennia, right? I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
That just is something that just kind of blows my mind. It's like they don't even think about what their kids are missing by not being able to figure out, like, oh, if I go to this corner and I turn the corner, then I can see down the street whether Bobby is playing down on his, in front of his house, or, they just, that's just not something that kids have available to them a lot of the time. And what does that do to your sense of self and possibility and just your normal ability to sort of go about human life in a productive way?
We found that progressing along a continuum of spatial knowledge was really limited unless the children were able to get around independently. And I think, as you're bringing up, the importance of independent mobility, and in terms, not just in terms of cognitive development, which we found, but also in terms of physical health and being able to function well in school and do well in school. And I think just have independence around, even, not just for children, but also for parents. So parents have the ability to not have to be shackled into carrying their children everywhere.
Yeah. And I mean, this gets to one of the sort of core concepts in the book, which is the concept of street ecology. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that idea and how you construct a theory of street ecology.
Certainly. I mean, this is one of the important contributions my father made, and it really talks about how nurturing and caring is the environment for you. And how is it helping us evolve and grow and connect with members of the community? How is it not just in terms of environmental quality, but ecological quality? How is it inviting us to feel a bigger sense of our neighborhood and home territory, which is another one of my father's findings in and around the community. So it takes the idea of the street environment and gives it a much richer sense of what it is and of what it can be. And I think that's another important contribution that, aside from it being just a conduit for traffic, it's really thinking about the street environment as being a place for people and the hearts of our cities.
And then there's a related sort of negative concept that you discuss, which is the barrier effect and how poorly designed roads and stroads and, major arterials and all of these dead spaces that we have constructed in order to give cars free rein, how those pieces of infrastructure actually create barriers to human connection and achievement and opportunity.
Absolutely. So, and his research really bears this out, that the heavily trafficked street is the one that rips the community apart and is a barrier to it. And others have done some important research on the barrier effects of traffic. And, it's the street can either bring us together and knit us together, or it could rip us apart. And I think that his research really helped open our eyes to what I also call not just the conflict and the power dynamic of the streets, but also the promise. Like, what is the promise of our streets? And so I basically took the book and divided it. I reorganized the book a bit and divided it into these 4 parts. One is the conflict, which is the research we talked about, the power dynamics, and the promise. And then after that, the future. And the promise being, how can we actually realize the promise of our streets? And that's another sort of hopeful message that I feel my father also pioneered.
And one of the things that's holding us back, I think, is what you refer to as the Stockholm syndrome of the street. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, there's this sort of sense that when we look at post-accident interviews, that people take on extra responsibility for, like a bicyclist. We found that bicyclists and pedestrians take on an extra set of responsibility, that they were actually more at fault than they really should be in terms of being hit in the street ecology. And so I came up with my friend Offer Grembeck, the idea that there's a Stockholm syndrome of the street, that people are actually beholden to their captors, which are the cars. And in the book, I also talk about auto domination and what does that actually mean? What does it actually look like? So this auto domination, there's this kinship you feel to your captors, and taking on the responsibility of you're being hit by a car, either by as a bicyclist or a pedestrian, is given greater weight. So that's basically the Stockholm syndrome of the street.
Yeah, it's this idea, I've spoken with Dr. Ian Walker, whose work on motonormativity is so important, and he talks about the is-ought fallacy, that, that we think, well, this is the way it is. That means it's the way it ought to be. And I think that's very much at play here, that, I feel scared to ride my bike. Riding my bike is dangerous. I might get hit. That's the way it is. I guess that's the way it's supposed to be because, that's the way it is. And I am dealing with something in my neighborhood where there's a new bike lane on a street adjacent to my house, and there's a lot of pushback going on from the business community because it's made it you can't double park on the street anymore now that there's a bike lane. And they say that they need people to be able to double park, which is, of course, illegal and dangerous, that without double parking, their businesses are going to go under, which, is not likely to be true. But I feel anxious as much as I want this bike lane to stay in there. And I'm, really dedicated to sort of fighting for the bike lane. There's a part of me that I've been sensing where I feel anxious about it. There's part of me that's like, oh, maybe we should just let them have it back for the cars because, and I've been sort of wondering, like, why do I feel that way? And then I was reading this and I'm like, oh, it's that I want to ingratiate myself in a sense or form an alliance with those forces of power because I don't have confidence that I will be able to be a respected entity in the community because cars are so dominated, right?
It's such an attractive mode of travel. And I can imagine with what you're saying, too, that there are people who you respect and like who might feel this need to support driving. It is again this sort of Stockholm syndrome of the street that there is we all sort of feel like, oh, maybe we should consider facilitating the automobile. Maybe we should support these automobile-philic motions and actions. So,
yeah.
But we also need to recognize how we need to re-see the environment and re-see things, and understand we're in this sort of matrix of auto domination, and it rules our world. And in so many ways, I mean, one of the things that Dan Bird and I talked about with these street transformation projects that we're studying is that there's always so much opposition because once you touch the street, everyone gets involved. And so, I mean, I think there's this way that we need to, what my father did is, I always think of the song, hey, hey, what's that sound? Everyone look what's going down or going round. And I think that that's sort of what he did is he helped us see something anew and afresh. If I can, I want to share with you one of the warnings my father provided because I think it's one of the best statements about auto domination there is.
Okay.
He says, the automobile, satisfier of private needs, demands, and whims, has created an insatiable demand for access and a whole profession of planners and engineers both serving and further stimulating that demand.
Mm. Yeah, that really puts it in a nutshell. That's, as you say, he had a real talent for writing. And
he did.
That talent, I think, sort of his graceful writing is, an embodiment of his graceful thinking about these things. And he was such a sort of inventive and imaginative thinker. I want to talk about two future-related things before we end this conversation. And one of them is something I've been struggling to wrap my mind around for a couple years now, and that is the advent of autonomous vehicles and robo-taxis in particular. There's so much debate in the transportation community at this point, well, they're safer than human drivers. They're going to result in a lot fewer fatalities and injuries. They are electrically powered, so they don't have tailpipe emissions, et cetera, et cetera. And I know all of that, and I accept all of that, and yet somehow, just viscerally, I don't want them. And I have been trying to interrogate why it is that I don't want them. And then, I came upon this passage in your book. If this new wave of driverless cars are large, fast, and everywhere, there is little doubt that our sense of the street, our senses of the essence of what it feels to be human could be deadened. And then you go on to say, we need to be stewards of our own humanity and dignity in the face of this newly emerging, highly technical society. In short, our streets should cradle our humanity by fostering dignified human experiences for restorative, rejuvenating, and joyful exchanges between people of all ages and backgrounds. And I just agree with that so thoroughly. And I guess I understand the advantages that these vehicles represent in many ways, but I'd love to hear you talk about what you think are the threats to the very core concept of livable streets that autonomous vehicles and robotaxis embody.
Right. Well, thanks for bringing up that quote, because I think it embodies a lot of what I'm shooting for in terms of making sure that we're careful going forward. And I'd have to say that when we look at the history of auto orientation and new automotive technologies, they've often led to bigger, faster cars. And that's one of the big concerns. And I think that there's been enough written that I hope that sort of is moderating the approaches that the autonomous vehicle companies are taking. Because you're right that actually the technology that they offer in terms of making things safer could be really beneficial. And I think that we should actually take those technologies now and adopt them in current vehicles, such as speed governors and intelligent speed assistance technology, anti-braking systems, and also making smaller vehicles as well. So I think it's something that we need to carefully monitor going forward. And I think that one of the things I've heard is that the autonomous vehicle trip rate right now is still pretty low. It's taking a long time to deploy the whole autonomous vehicle system. And their collision safety profile, I think, is doing pretty well right now. But my concern is that the vehicles are bigger and faster and lead to an environment where pedestrians, especially, and bicyclists get edged out. And one of the reasons that I feel this is important is autonomous vehicles are still trying to figure out how to operate with pedestrians in the mix. I think that the last thing I'd want to see is pedestrians get sort of edged out of the street environment because of autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, that's something I've worried about, and people keep telling me not to worry about it. But I was just in Austin, and Austin, to my eye, has more autonomous vehicles than San Francisco, Los Angeles, where it's become common to see them on the street, of course. But in Austin, you can stand on any street downtown and, within just a few minutes, you'll see 3, 5, 10 go by, several at a time. And it sort of gives you an idea of what the streetscape might be like if all of the vehicles were autonomous. And it's interesting because as a pedestrian, even as I understand that I'm safer with autonomous vehicles, there's something about them not having human beings in control of them and of removing that human element from the street, as flawed and dangerous as human drivers are, that the idea that all of the vehicles around me one day might be vehicles to which I cannot make any appeal on a human level. It's sort of like, now when you call customer service, you only get a bot. You only get, an automated answer. And that's going to be more and more true. And it just seems like just another way that human beings are going to be removed from, a lot of places, stores, you don't have a human being checking you out anymore, et cetera. So, as much as I know, gosh, human drivers are terrible. I see them do terrible things every day, and you don't see Waymos doing that. but the texture of the street, there's something about the ecology of the street that is changed in a profound way by having robot cars that concerns me.
No, absolutely. I mean, my concern is that it's going to feel like living in a watch.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to feel just that mechanized, and
Mm-hmm.
I think removing that human element is really a problem. That's why I think what we should shoot for is to modify the cars that exist on the road right now and those that get purchased with like intelligent speed assistance technology and speed governors and early detection braking systems and hopefully make smaller vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those would be, I mean, if we can do those with autonomous vehicles, we should do those with existing vehicles now. I wrote an article, Street Livability in the Era of Driverless Cars, that talks about, Billy Riggs and I talk about the different approaches we should be taking in terms of the street, the vehicles, and the drivers. And so that might be something your listeners might want to look at as well.
I want to wrap up now, but you talk about the future. And I, again, want to just ask you an open-ended question. What are some of the ways that we can continue to fight for livable streets, for human streets, and for sort of the humanity of cities in general? Like, how can people fight for that? Because I think that increasingly we're living in a world, as we've been saying, where humanity is being drained out of so many of the interactions that we have and that we've taken for granted. And we're seeing, these record rates of loneliness, depression, anxiety. How can we fight for livable streets that are good and healthy for humans?
Good question. I'm sorry for the shameless plug, but the research in Livable Streets and Livable Streets 2.0 is seminal and timeless and can help people understand the greater harms that cars and traffic impart on communities and impact communities with. And I think that research could be used to help mobilize efforts to do such things as slow traffic down. One of the biggest harms is speeding traffic. One of the graphics that I'll provide for you to put up online is that traffic casualties and fatalities go up dramatically between 20 and 30 miles an hour. Now, why is that? Well, basically, I think that we as humans have evolved to withstand head trauma at the highest speeds we can run, which is around 25 miles an hour. So there's a physiobiologic component to slowing cars down, and I think slowing vehicles down is key to making our streets safer, and also lower the noise impacts, lower the fear impacts, things like that. So slowing cars down, I think, is really key, and I think we do through intelligence, speed assistance technology, traffic calming, and just the way we design our streets. Again, I think the research, moderating speeds. The book also has a whole roadmap of doing things for pedestrians and bicyclists, as well as traffic calming. My father, in the original book, Livable Streets, was really about traffic calming. And I added whole sections on pedestrian and bicycle planning and street redesign. I took the book from 300 pages to 600 pages and added these sections. So it's a much larger book. It also talks about mobilizing people to make street changes. And as we mentioned, changing the street environment is not easy. So it also talks about being a change agent, how to mobilize support for your efforts. And so there could be many different efforts taken by many different people to lower speeds, to improve pedestrian and bicycle and traffic calming infrastructure, and just be open to the idea of changing your environment. As Dan Burton and I talked about the last few days, being change agents is so important to transforming our street environments to make them safer and livable.
Yeah, and that requires bravery and information and solidarity with your fellow residents and your neighbors and, really keeping those human connections alive. So sort of by fighting for your streets to be more human, I think you're already activating so much.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what you need to be cognizant of is that there are going to be a lot of people resisting the change. It takes a lot of patience and effort to get that change to happen, but be aware and be fulfilled by the fact that a lot of people have gone through this before.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Bruce. This was really great. And I just have to say, what an honor you've done to your father's legacy by continuing it and broadening it and keeping it alive. So thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all the work you've done. Thank you so much for having me, and congratulations on your book as well.
That's it for this episode of The War on Cars. Thanks again to Bruce Appleyard for joining us. Remember, you can support us by signing up on Patreon at patreon.com/thewaroncarspod. And you can read our book, Life After Cars, Freeing Ourselves from the Tyranny of the Automobile, out now from Thesis, a Penguin Random House imprint. Go to lifeaftercars.com to find out more about the book and also our upcoming tour dates. A big thanks to everyone who supports us, including our top Patreon contributors, Charlie G. of Human Powered Law in Portland, Oregon, Mark Headland, Virginia Baker, and Brandon DeCoster. Thanks also to our friends at Cleverhood. Listeners of The War on Cars can save 15% on the best rain gear for walking and cycling now through the end of January with code New Year, New Gear at cleverhood.com/waroncars. The War on Cars is produced with support from the Helen and William Mazer Foundation. This episode was edited by Samantha Gatzek. It was recorded by Walter Nordquist at the Brooklyn Podcasting Studio. Our theme music is by Nathaniel Goodyear. Transcripts are by Russell Gregg. Our logo is by Danny Finkel. I'm Sarah Goodyear, and this is The War on Cars.